Good evening, everybody. It's not legal advice. No jokes. I just wanted to do because I don't think this topic is fit for jokes. So I'm going to skip the jokes for this live stream. I'm going to do a subsequent live stream later on, probably when this is over, very short on GTII. This one will not address GTII at all. So if you're not interested in the plane crash and an interesting set of facts, at least in the way I see it, then feel free to leave. But if you're interested in this story, because I think the story is interesting, and I don't think you're going to hear this story anywhere, not that I'm claiming any conspiracy or anything like that, but I think I have an interesting presentation that I thought about today. And I have some connection to it in some vague way, but I think it's an interesting story. So what I'm talking about is last night, obviously, I'm sure you're all aware, there was a plane crash in the Potomic, and a regional plane coming, I think, from Kansas crashed in the Potomac after it crashed into, or actually after a helicopter crashed into the airplane. And I heard recently that they have now found the flight recorders, and I think they've retrieved approximately, it's pretty grim, 40 bodies of the total number of bodies that were on the plane. I can only, my deepest condolences to the families, obviously the victims, but to the families who have to deal with all this. I can only imagine, what how difficult that is. So it's really a terrible thing. I'm not, and I suspect a cause last night, and it's not really the point of this. I wanted to kind of set up a bunch of facts, but last night because I saw it when it happened, or not long after it happened, I was happened to be watching the news at the time, and my conclusion, without knowing anything else, is I figured the helicopter pilot must have got distracted. That was my conclusion, and I haven't heard anything differently yet. However, they have the flight recorder, and we'll see. And apparently, one of the air traffic controllers had to work two different positions. Was that unusual? Apparently not, but that's probably not optimum. But I don't know if that was a cause also. But I presume, just my conclusion, and as a layman not knowing anything, that it was just a distracted pilot, and an error just happens. And unfortunately, they were too low to kind of correct. My wife's uncle and one of my friends, who's now deceased, Roger, he was in Vietnam, and he had air duty, and although he wasn't that type at all, if you saw him, but he used to talk about, in airplanes, you don't worry about anything as long as you have altitude. But if you don't have altitude, there's not much you can do. And unfortunately, obviously, these planes were too low to the plane and the helicopter were too low to the ground. And even if they hadn't disintegrated or separated, they probably didn't have enough time to stop. But be that as it may. So let's take that. Everybody knows about that incident. So I thought about it, and I thought about, and I kind of confirmed this, but in 1969, so let's go back in time. 1969, there was in San Francisco, and it was a 727 and a Cessna. They collided. I think they were both leaving. One was going, I think, to Ontario, California. One might have been going to Sacramento. The smaller one is probably going to Sacramento, more local. And the 727, which was a smaller version of, you've all flown, or probably most of you have flown in 737s or an equivalent Airbus. It's like 140, 150 passengers, and could be different configurations. This was slightly smaller, but it was, well used. So these two planes, upon ascent, so they were leaving San Francisco, they collided in midair. For whatever reason, good luck, the 727 suffered no harm. The Cessna was able to fly back, and the 727 flew on to its destination, arrived in Ontario, no problems. The Cessna went back to San Francisco, had damage, apparently had significant damage, but was able to make it back to the airport, no crash, no fatalities, no problem. 1978, in San Diego, there was, and this was near the airport at a low elevation, and there was a midair collision between a 727 and a Cessna. And apparently it was a clear day, so there wasn't a problem. And everybody in the tower was, so the tower, the air traffic controllers had spoken to the various planes and vehicles. They all were aware of the others. They were given basically, that they had to visually confirm that they saw what they needed to see. So the Cessna confirmed seeing the 727, the 727 confirmed seeing the Cessna. And I think the 727 was full. So there was, I think, 4 pilots somehow on board. There was somebody extra. I think there were normally 3, but they were carrying an extra pilot. And they were all talking to the tower. And what happened was the pilots in the 727 lost sight of the Cessna. So they believed they had passed the Cessna, and they're still communicating with the tower. And their language is a little bit not definitive, like, are you sure they passed? And the response of one of the pilots is like, probably. So they weren't certain, but they believed that they had passed the Cessna. Unfortunately, what was the reality of it is the Cessna was ahead of them and a lower elevation, and the 727 was descending to land. So they were about 2,000 feet going down, again, at a lower elevation. The Cessna, who acknowledged seeing the plane, but there was some kind of blind spot on the Cessna, so it didn't have a great view. And it turned out the pilot of the Cessna was a Marine who was practicing his landing. I think it was landing maneuvers. That was the idea. And he was wearing some kind of hood, a specialized hood that prohibited you from kind of having your eyes look out. So your focus was kind of central. And but he acknowledged having seen the plane. But apparently at some point in time, he lost sight also. And the air traffic control at the airport, they indicated, use visual, but they said they had radar available, which they could have used, but they put the obligation on the pilots to make sure they had a visual read. So the pilots in the 727 descend, and unfortunately, they descend into the Cessna. This is like 2,000 feet. The planes crash, they disintegrate. Everybody on board was killed. I think it's like 144 passengers were killed. It was, at that time, the biggest loss of life in any plane crash in the United States. Everybody on both planes were killed, and some people on the ground were killed also, because the planes, the way San Diego is set up, I think the airport is near the coast, but where this happened was in a residential area, and some of the pieces of the plane landed on a house, and it was a mess. But it was a terrible accident. And when they did the investigation, they attributed the responsibility to the pilots in the 727, who were obligated to keep a visual. If they said they had a visual on the plane, they really had a visual on the plane. They also said, as it turned out, oddly enough, and it was like, one of these odd things, the Cessna had a certain course. Instead of staying on that course, at the end, they made a turn. And unfortunately, that turn, that was a deviation, put them precisely in the line of the 727. the investigation brought that up. It said they still attributed the responsibility to the plane. They also acknowledged that the air traffic control could have done a better job. They could have used radar. So, what about this? So we have these two incidents, and kind of the first one in 1969 is kind of a precursor. So we have a midair collision, but no fatalities. The second one is, at the time, the worst collision in the United States. Now, the airline that was flying both those flights was PSA. It was called Pacific Southwest Airlines. Pacific Southwest Airlines was a regional airline carrier that served primarily California. So I've kind of talked about Sacramento, Ontario, LA, San Diego, all the cities. And it was a regional airline that was busy and would go up and down the states, low cost. Eventually, like Southwest took over their spot, and that was kind of the model that they replaced. After this accident in 78, you can imagine because of the nature of the accident, because it was the largest accident, and before the internet, it killed their business. And maybe justifiably, I don't know, but it killed their business. I should mention before I go into that, what I remember that crash, by the way, in San Diego. The reason why I remember the crash, it was a huge event. So in 78, I was still an old guy. I was maybe 19, 78. Yeah, I'd been 19, I guess. Wow, I was young. I was a news hound, so I would have known about it anyway. But it turned out my cousin, who lived in the same condominium complex as I did, at least growing up, her boyfriend was on that plane. And so she lost her boyfriend, who died in that plane crash. But the result of that plane crash is it killed the business. So what happened was, eventually they were going to go bankrupt or out of business. US Air bought PSA. I think eventually US Air was going to go out of business, and American Airlines purchased US Air. When at some point in time, American Airlines set up a regional airline system, and there were 6 regional airlines. Like, you've heard some of them, I think, like Piedmont. I don't know if ever you've heard of those. But one of those regional airlines that American Eagle operates, owned by American Airlines, is PSA. And the flight that crashed in the Potomic was a PSA flight involving a midair collision between two vehicles, where it's suspected, whereas the prior San Diego one, the guy was wearing a hood, it's suspected that perhaps the helicopter pilot who was doing training was wearing goggles, night vision goggles, and that the night vision goggles might have impacted his vision. That's why he didn't see, and he was distracted, because he might have seen the plane. But of all airlines to be involved, PSA 3 times in midair collisions. So I'm not saying there's any connection. I'm just saying it's an odd set of events. And if nothing else, by now, the airline PSA should be retired permanently. Thanks for your attention. Hope that was an interesting story. Again, my sympathies and condolences to all those who were injured, all those who are, who had relatives, friends who died in that plane. Anyway, thought it was an interesting story. Again, I think it was just distraction of the pilots, but we will find out. And again, PSA needs to be put to bed. Thanks. Have a good night.